Thank you all for being here. I'm super excited about this class because honestly, I have no idea about any of this. And every time someone asks me about it and I have to explain it, I'm like, well, it was, you see, the Iberian Peninsula, and there was a lot going on. And, the Islam community was very different than other communities and had a lot, anyway. So I'm excited to hear what it's actually about rather than my terrible attempts at explaining to others what it's about. So I'm glad you're here. Very warm welcome to Ivonne Wallace-Fuentes. She's at Roanoke College. And we're just, it's kind of a blessing that we have these type and caliber of people in our church that are willing to come and do these sort of classes for us. And we can learn so much and hear about interesting topics. So I'm glad you're here. I'm not going to talk long. Turn it over to you. And you're all set. You don't need a microphone or anything else?
I don't think so. Can everybody hear me?
Do you want to come? You want to stay up there?
Oh, I'm going to move around.
Okay.
That's my MO.
All right. Sounds good.
Well, thank you so very much. And I really want to thank everybody at St. John's that's made possible my opportunity to stand before you this morning and to talk about something that I really, really care about. Especially since I know that there might be some people in the room who are thinking about doing the Camino de Santiago coming up soon. I hope that there's something in what we talk about today that gives you a little bit more context for the incredible adventure that lies before you. So just to give you a little bit about me, I teach at Roanoke College. I'm a professor of history there. My research interests are actually on contemporary Latin America. I work on revolutionary movements in the 20th century. So at some point in the future, Chrissy promises me that I'll get a chance to come here and talk to you about liberation theology. But right now, one of the things that I'm teaching about, so it's a teaching field, not a research field, is Islamic State, which is a fascinating world that is often overlooked in the way that we tell the history of the Western world, right? If you're very interested in Islam, you tend to follow the path of the religion itself out of the Arabian Peninsula. As you'll see, when it first explodes into an empire, the first capital is in Damascus. Then there's like this incredibly tragic night when one dynasty takes over from another and they kill everybody except one guy. And then they decide, we're not going to have a capital in Damascus anymore. We're going to move. And they move to Baghdad, right? So if you're studying the history of Islam, you follow them as they move from Damascus to Baghdad. And if you're studying the history of Europe, right, as this is the history most of us are more familiar with, we start with the Greeks, of course. Chrissy met my son, who is right now in like full Percy Jackson mode. So all we learn about is like the Greeks and the Romans and that classical foundation that really tells us who we are as Western people. But then, you know, Rome falls. And we enter into the Dark Ages. We literally call them the Dark Ages, right? Because it is sandwiched between the glories of the classical past and then what we see as the real foundations of our society, which is the Renaissance, right? The Enlightenment, all that moment when we recapture that classical past. And so the period that we're about to talk about is smack in the middle of those dark ages. So if we were studying Islam, we'd be in Baghdad and learning about the House of Wisdom. And if we were studying Western Europe, right, we'd be in the Dark Ages and we'd be running through this very, very quickly to try to get to the Renaissance or the Enlightenment. In both of those historiographical traditions, we tend to skip this period. But it's a fascinating period, as I hope I'll be able to convince you. So just to give you a sense of what we're going to do, this is a 2-class series. In this particular first class, I'm going to give you an overview of the beginning of this period and introduce the concept of convivencia, which in Spanish means living together, right? And this is one of the reasons why people are so excited about studying this period, because as you will see, it's a period where people of the 3 Abrahamic faiths, you know, Christians, Muslims, and Jews, seem to live together in what for the time period, and actually even by our standards, appears to be living together, doing just fine, right? Not killing each other, not running around, trying to forcibly convert one another, which, as we know, will be one of the marks of the later European historical context. So one of the questions that will drive us is not just what's going on here, but is this convivencia thing a real thing? Did this happen? And then in the second class that we'll do next week, we'll start talking a little bit more about some of the artistic glories that are made possible by this convivencia. And for me right now, the one that I'm most interested in is poetry, because it turns out that Arabic, the language itself, is considered by many to be one of the most poetic languages on the planet. And poetry is one of the art forms that Arab speakers value and treasure the most. Okay? And one of the things that happens in this context in medieval Iberia is everybody speaking Arabic. And so some Jewish scholars take that Arabic and use it to then convert the Hebrew that they only read, that's a liturgical language, and they turn it into a living, breathing, pulsing, poetic language, a secular poetic language, in an intellectual feat that, quite frankly, still stuns. And so now we can actually read these poems, not in the original Hebrew, I wish, right? But we can read them in translation and get a sense of the kinds of worlds that they are opening up. So that's what we're going to be doing. The first thing that we need to talk about is Islam. And I don't really know how much background everybody here has on Islam, but as you know, Islam is the latest of the Abrahamic faiths, right? It arises in the Arabian Peninsula when the Prophet Muhammad is visited by an angel who gives him a revelation, and eventually that revelation is written down, and that is the Quran. Okay. There are a couple things about Islam that are very important for our discussion today, and I'm going to highlight two in particular. The first is that it is very easy to convert into Islam, like even easier than Christianity, right? And the second is that among the many articles of faith and requirements of the Islamic tradition, observant Muslims are asked, to the degree that they can, to travel at least once in their lifetime to Mecca to make a religious pilgrimage, right? The Hajj. And so as Islam expands, all of these Muslims who can work really, really hard, at least once in their life, to travel to Mecca. Okay? And we will see the repercussions of that particular tradition and how it changes the nature of the Islamic Empire in just a second. So this is a map of the world, the Mediterranean world, as you may be familiar with it. What you will see up there in what is in this map called Lombards, right? Italy, as we know it. That's where the Roman Empire emerges and spreads out. And what I want you to see from this map is that in many ways, the Islamic Empire that emerges after the birth of Muhammad tends to cover the same kind of space, right? It actually gets bigger than Rome. It explodes even faster, right? The place that we're looking at, of course, is what you and I now know as Spain and Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula. The Iberian Peninsula had been a thriving, if marginal, part of the Roman Empire, right? Very famous Romans were born in what they called Hispania, right? Julius Caesar, if memory serves, for example, was born in that part of the empire. It was fully integrated into Rome. And what it means to be fully integrated into an empire like Rome meant that you had things like infrastructure, you had roads, you had aqueducts, right? You had trading connections so that Roman goodies from other parts of the empire could come to where you were far, far away. When Rome falls, right? And again, when Rome falls, it is not Rome fell on a Tuesday night and Wednesday everything was different kind of situation, right? It's a slow process that takes the place of generations. And what ends up happening is that the power of Rome to be able to exert its control over the edges of the empire slowly recedes over time. And as you and I know, power abhors a vacuum, right? And so when Romans can't control the edges, other people start coming into those edges, right? And one of the people that start entering into what is the Iberian Peninsula as Rome's control of that area slowly dissipates are people we call the Visigoths, the Western Goths. So we come in, and times are really rough in the Iberian Peninsula at that point, because all of those goodies of empire are there no longer. Nobody's keeping up those roads, right? Nobody's keeping up those trade networks. So crops don't do as well, right? People don't do as well. Commerce fails. People aren't building stuff, right? And who are the people there, right? For the most part, they're Christians, right? They are converted to Christianity under the Visigoths. There is a substantial community of Jewish people who seem to have gotten there about 200, 300 years before the Visigoths. So it's already a religiously diverse place. The Visigoths repress the Jewish community quite forcefully. pretty terrible, right? This is not a good time to be a member of the Jewish community in Iberia. So that's where we are until the key year. And in my class, my students always come in and they're like scared because they're like, I'm terrible with like names and dates. And I'm like, in this class, you need to know 2 dates, right? You need to know 7/11 and 1492. And one of them you already know. And what the other you'll easily remember because who will ever forget 7/11, right? So in the year 7/11, Berbers, so North African peoples, enter into Iberia, right? So this is a moment when we have to use our words very carefully because one of our first instincts is to use the word conquer, right? So Muslim peoples come in 7/11 and conquer the Visigoths, and there are battles, and Visigoths do lose those battles. So, you know, a normal sort of natural common sense understanding of what's happening is that it's a conquest. But actually what happened was that the Visigoths were fighting amongst themselves. They were trying to figure out which son was going to be able to take over from a king who had just died. And so what they did is one son called over to North Africa and asked the Berbers to join him in his dynastic struggles. And so the Berbers do, right? And then they stay, because it turns out they really liked what they saw. So the lesson that we learn here is that this is a world where there is conflict, right? But you and I as modern people look back on that and expect that conflict to be based on religious difference. We expect to see Muslim people conquering Christian Visigoths. So therefore, it's about the expansion of Islam. When in fact, what it was an everyday ho-hum sibling rivalry, right, between princes. It's about dynastic and political conflict, just like we find everywhere else in Europe. And actually, confessional differences were not the primary and driving factor. But it does change the nature and the history of Europe, okay? Mostly because you remember I told you about that terrible night in Damascus and the fact that there was one prince who survives the wholesale slaughter of his family, and once again, a dynastic conflict, right? That one prince happened to be born of Syrian nobility on his father's side and from a Berber tribeswoman on his mother's side. So when it hit the fan and he couldn't stay in Damascus because he was literally being chased by assassins, right? He runs from Syria all the way to his mother's people in North Africa. And this is a man whose fortunes have really, really taken a terrible, terrible downward spiral, right? He had expected to be a prince in Damascus. Now he is running for his life, chased by assassins, now seeking solace among the sheep herding people of his mother, okay? But he happens to arrive when some of these Berbers have just made the incursion, right, into Iberia, and so he follows them. And when the Berbers essentially decide that these Visigoths aren't really doing a good job and they can stay and take over themselves, he is the one who manages to coalesce people around him, and he founds a new dynasty. Okay? So the drama and the romance of this figure cannot possibly be overstated, and I cannot believe HBO hasn't yet made a movie about his life. But we are literally talking about a young man who, by all measures, should have been the end of his line, and instead, he found a new one, right? And so the branch that he found, and he makes his capital city Córdoba, right, is the branch of the Umayyads that have just been extinguished in Damascus. And now he's in Córdoba. And what he will try to recreate is he will try to recreate the glories of his family's past, just now in Córdoba. So one way to think about Córdoba is that Córdoba is always looking back to Damascus, right? It will try to recreate. It is a memory palace of Damascus, as our young prince, who was also a poet, because, of course, once wrote in a poem, he was a transplanted olive tree, right? So what once grew in one place now grows in a new soil in Córdoba. This is Córdoba. This is one of the most spectacular buildings in the world, and those of you who have a chance to travel to Spain, please, 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 if you don't go there, don't tell me. It will break my heart. So this is the Mosque of Córdoba. This is one of the great buildings that our young prince, whose name is Abd al-Rahman, begins to build. And the reason I want to highlight it to you is not just because it is literally a wonder of our world, because it also helps to make this argument about what Córdoba is, right? The characteristic of this building is huge. It's a huge, huge building. Is what scholars call the hippo style or forest of arches that you see within the building, right? I think it's like 800 arches. There's just so many arches, and when you walk among it, it's a space that just stuns and calls us to witness God's glory in horizontal space, right? So when you walk into a Gothic cathedral, usually your eyes are pulled upward, right? So we're pulled up to consider the glories of the divine. In this space, you are called to look horizontally, right? It's a much more horizontal space. It is a forest of arches. And these arches, which become characteristic of the medieval Iberian context, so that when you see these arches, a lot of people will say, oh, that's Moorish, right? Oh, that's Islamic. What they are actually a wonderful palimpsest. They are a combination of the different cultures that are all starting to live together in one group. So the horseshoe shape of the arch itself is actually Visigothic. Okay, so that comes from the Christian tradition, the Visigoths who were there. But those candy stripes, those vividly red and white stripes, which again, even to our eyes right now, sort of call our attention. Try to imagine if you're in the 800s where paint is really expensive, right? Like these are so fantastically ornamental, right? They have to be explained. And we can explain them because what they are doing in Córdoba is trying to recreate in paint what in Damascus was done in marble. So if you had gone to the great mosque in Damascus, you would have seen arches. They weren't horseshoe, but they were arches that had stripes made out of the different kinds of marble that they quarried. So Abd al-Rahman is trying to do the same thing in Córdoba, but he doesn't have all that marble, but he has paint. And so he paints these vividly red and white candy striped arches. So when you see this, you should not think, oh, Moorish. You should think, oh, Iberian. This is only possible because of the three different types of traditions that exist in this place at that time. Save that for the next class. All right, so Córdoba is also now part of another empire. Just like once it was part of the Roman Empire, now it's part of the Islamic Empire. And once again, empire brings its fruits. It brings aqueducts, it brings roads, it brings technology. And one of the things that we need to remember is that at this moment in human history, the vanguard of technological and scientific thinking is all Islamic, okay? And it has a lot to do with that Hajj that we were talking about earlier, okay? So one of the things that happens is as the Islamic empire expands, and it expands and expands and expands, if you recall that map we just saw, it's touching China, right? At the same time that it is touching Spain. And what happens is, during the Hajj, as people come in from all parts of the empire and meet in Mecca, they trade the ideas and the technologies that they bring from every part of the empire. What technologies, you might ask? Paper from China, which makes writing things really, really easy. So it makes it absolutely easier to transmit information. The Chinese loved fireworks, right? The only thing that makes fireworks work is gunpowder, which some enterprising mind figured out could also be used for other things, right? The magnetic compass, right? All of those things are being brought in from the edges, from other peoples that Islamic peoples are finding, and they're being brought to Mecca so that within a year, which is a stunningly short amount of time in the world without the internal combustion engine, right? Within a year, a technology that would only have been known in parts of China can be found in the halls of Córdoba. Boom, right? From the perspective of Spain, the most important technologies included agricultural technologies. So Córdoba used these technologies to make gardens, beautiful gardens, right? Buildings like the one we just talked about, and libraries. Because one of the things that Islamic scholars were very interested in was finding the wisdom of classical cultures. So they would find things in Greek, Aristotle, that had been lost to Europe. They found it in Greek and they translated it into Arabic. But it wasn't just the Greeks. They were interested in all knowledge. So they found classics out of Persian libraries. They found classics out of Sanskrit libraries, which is why you and I now use numerals that we call Arabic numerals, right? They were not developed by Islamic peoples. They are Sanskrit in origin, but they were found by Islamic peoples who discovered, hey, this is a really useful way to keep a ledger, and boom, it explodes throughout the empire, right? This is exactly what's happening with all of these agricultural and luxury technologies. So that those of you who know Spanish may be interested to know that about a third, 27, 26%, right, of words in Spanish are derived from Arabic. So any word that starts with AL, especially if it has to do with the good life, so things like algodón, right, cotton, almuerzo, lunch, alfombra, right, rug, right, all of those are derived from Arabic in this time period. So, a land of gardens. This, by the way, for those of you who go to Spain, is a view of the Alhambra, right? One of our best examples remaining of a medieval Islamic palace. And the reason that it is a great example is that it is as surrounded by gardens as those palaces would have been in their glory. Science and technology. Has anybody ever heard of Abbas ibn Firnas? I hadn't either until I started teaching this class. Turns out he was a sage. He lived in Cordoba. What you and I would call a Renaissance man, right? He was interested in poetry. He was interested in the sciences. He was interested in technology. One day when he was 70 years old, and again, may I remind you, this is 70 years old in the 800s, right? Not for us today, right? When he was 70 years old, he took a lot of this knowledge and he built a machine out of wood and silk and feathers, and he was the first human being on this planet to fly. So he crawled up to the top of a cliff, and he threw himself off, and he flew for 10 minutes. He survived. He broke his leg, but he survived, right? This is the world that Cordoba built, right? Tragically, that really beautiful commemorative statue, not in Cordoba, it's in Baghdad. So the other reason for our class that this world is so compelling to us is because confessional differences, right? So whether you were a Jewish person, whether you were a Christian person, they didn't really limit your future in Cordoba. Okay. Now, a couple things that we need to make sure everybody understands. Under Islamic law, if you were a Jewish or a Christian person, you were considered a protected category. Okay, they called it the dhimmi. The dhimmi were people of the book. They were people of previous revelations, right? And under Islamic religious law, you were not supposed to convert them. Okay. It's unfortunate that they hadn't received the latest prophet, but they were considered a cousin religion. And as long as they paid a tax, they could practice their religion quietly. So there were always some things you couldn't do. You couldn't go up and, for example, try to proselytize among your Muslim neighbors, but as long as you sort of kept low, then you could just be Jewish and Christian forever, right? There was also a financial incentive because that tax, that dhimmi tax, was a really important source of income to these Muslim polities, right? So they didn't actually want everybody to convert because then they would lose some of that really important money. Okay. It's also important that we remember that this is a world before our modern conception of a separation between state and religion, right? So if you and I have a dispute and you are of a religion that I do not share, we can just go to the police station and there will be a civil authority that will help us adjudicate our conflict, right? And so it has nothing to do whether you and I follow the same religion. There's a police officer there who has recourse to a law that says, no, this is what happened. Right? This is not that world. Okay, the early modern world had no civil authority. The only laws were religious laws. So one way to think about this is Cordoba is a city with 3 different laws, right? There is laws for Christian, there's laws for Muslims, there are laws for the Jewish community, and each one had their own authorities, right? So there were Muslim judges who oversaw Muslim law, there were Christian judges who oversaw Christian law, etc. Okay. So we have a world where if you were a Jew of great medical training, you could rise to the very, very highest levels of power. Abd al-Rahman III, the caliph, right? So this is the man who has now declared that he is not just the ultimate political authority, but the ultimate religious authority of Islam. His trusted physician who kept him alive through multiple close calls was a Jewish man. When Abd al-Rahman needed to send a diplomat to the darkest ages of Europe, he sent a Christian bishop, right? So he was perfectly comfortable having men of high caliber help him administer his empire, independent of their religion. But not everybody was comfortable with this convivencia, if you and I will use that term. What you see before you here is actually a woodcut of a later age about the martyrdom of Pelagius. Okay? This is happening in Córdoba in the 800s, about the same time as we have these Jewish courtiers rising to the very top, right? At the same time as the mosque is being built, as those gardens are flowering. And some Christian bishops are very upset. They are very, very upset because all their young men want to learn Arabic. And they want to dress in the Arabic style. And like the hottest, fanciest thing, the Minecraft of their age, if you will, it is all Arabic, Arabic, Arabic. And none of these men are learning Latin. And none of them, they're still Christian, right? They are still Christian. They've maintained to the faith of their fathers, but they now speak in Arabic. They dress in Arabic. They are now culturally Arabic. Right? We call these people Mozarabs, right? So they are still Christian, but they are culturally Arabic. They have entered the house of Arabic. And people like Patches are so upset about this. They're like, we need to come up with a plan. We are losing our cultural integrity. We can't do that. What's our plan? Okay, we're going to spark a mass rebellion. Okay, how are we going to do that? Well, they convinced a couple, and by a couple, I mean there's like 20, 25 young, religiously driven people, men and women, and they went up to some of these Muslim judges and they blasphemed the name of the Prophet, which you cannot do. You cannot do. That is one of the laws that you cannot break. And these judges were so confused. They were like, you Christian man, what's wrong? Take it back. Maybe you don't know that you just broke an important law. And the guy would just keep blaspheming. And the judges, we literally have these in the sources. The judges would be like, are you drunk? Can I take you somewhere? Like, you know, what can I do to make sure that you don't keep committing this criminal act that is only going to lead to your death? But ultimately, the death was what these martyrs wanted. And we know them now as the Cordovan martyrs. Okay, so just as we shake our head in terror and rage and confusion when we see young men strapping vests to their bodies and walking into places to commit great acts of terror, such were these Christian martyrs whose job it was, they saw, to be driven by God to spark a rebellion against Islamic authority. About 25 were martyred. And all the Christians around them thought they were crazy. They were like, we do not want a rebellion. We're actually quite happy. Like, you need to lay low, right? So it did not, in fact, spark the kind of massive resistance against Muslim authority that these Christian zealots had hoped, right? So this gives us a sense that not everything is peachy keen, right? Convivencia isn't automatically meaning that everybody loves each other, right? This is not ideological tolerance. But if you were a member of the Mozarab masses, right, the people who are wondering, why are these crazy people doing this? You feel like you have a pretty decent life and you don't want to spoil it, right? You might actually have perfectly fine relations with your Muslim neighbors who you see when you go buy bread at the same place or when you go to the same bathhouses. Yes, you may go to a different house of worship on different days, but even that's not necessarily a given. In many cases, they shared a house of worship, just that Muslims would go on Friday and Christians would go on Sunday, right? That's what convivencia meant. Living together because we share a space, not necessarily because we share beliefs or even tolerate our beliefs. There's not a lot of evidence that people were asking questions. So what you and I would think of as interfaith dialogue, that's not part of this. What is part of this is we share a space. How are we going to make that space work for us? And how are we going to make that space beautiful for us? It's just like class, Jennifer. Okay. So that gives us a sense of how some Christians were concerned about what was happening. Cordoba flourishes, right? But as we all know, everything that begins must end. And right after the turn of the millennium, Cordoba is sacked. This is like the most nostalgic picture I could find of this, and I think it works so beautifully. These are the remains of Madinat al-Sakhra. This is the palace that the caliph had built for himself on the outskirts of Cordoba. Okay, in around the year 1000, there is a civil war that breaks out, and Cordoba is destroyed. Those libraries are burned. People are hunted down. This building was sacked so completely it was not discovered again until the 20th century. Okay. But as you can see, and perhaps the glare doesn't really allow you, but you can see these sort of evocative glimpses of what that is. Those are those arches, right? And if you look on the inside, you see those white and red stripes that tell us once again, this isn't a Moorish architecture. This isn't a Moorish place. This is an Iberian place, right? And it housed not just the Muslim governors and the caliph and his entourage, his household, but it housed Christians, it housed Jews, right? And then it was gone. For the people living at that time, the destruction of Cordoba was a catastrophe that shook their world. Okay. It destroyed everything that they thought they knew about how the world should work. It destroyed everything they thought they knew about beauty and knowledge and wisdom. Boom, all gone. Of course, we're historians looking at this now 1,000 years later, right? And we know that this was actually just a chapter because, as we will cover in the next class, when you take a beautiful plate and you crash it on the floor, yes, that plate is destroyed forever. Cordoba will never be rebuilt. There will never be one city, once again, that controls everything, right? The center has fallen, but those shards explode all over the Iberian Peninsula. And suddenly you have all sorts of little cities, Seville, Granada, Toledo, and all of them remember Cordoba. And all of them have a shard of that plate, and all of them will now try to recreate the glories of Cordoba. And nobody will ever build the Mosque of Cordoba again, but maybe we can have just enough poets so that now we have even more flourishing arts. Maybe now we'll have little buildings all over the place, right? So in one way, the destruction of Cordoba is absolutely a devastating end. In another, it's a beginning where those seeds of what it meant to be in Cordoba were spread throughout the rest of the Iberian Peninsula. And what you see before you is one of the best examples we still have in our modern world of this moment. This is the ceiling of the Hall of the Ambassadors in the Alhambra in Granada, which is one of those cities that emerges, one of those places that has a shard, right? And has created the best example we have of a medieval Muslim palatial style. So that is where we are so far. I've left myself enough time so that if you have questions or concerns, I am happy to hear them. And as I said, next week, what we'll cover is what happens during this Taifa period when these little cities emerge, and the glories of the Hebrew Golden Age of poetry, which will be one of the blessings, quite frankly, one of the cardinal achievements of the human imagination that is made possible by this transition. So, yes?
You said a civil war. This would be the Catholic Christian side against the Muslim side. Is that the civil
Right,
war?
so that's our assumption, but no, it's Berbers. So it's actually intra-Muslim conflict. So Berbers from North Africa come up, and they are very upset because it turns out that Syrians, aristocratic Syrians, hold all the power and all the best lands, and the Berber Joe on the street, right, doesn't get much, but is expected to fight all of these wars. So it's that intra-Muslim conflict that ultimately leads to the destruction of Cordoba. So this is another one of those examples where we assume that that civil war is going to be religious, but no, it has everything to do with internal conflicts within the Muslim community itself. Excellent question. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your lively, entertaining, energetic lecture. It's
With
really-
one cup of coffee.
it-
See me after two. Yeah.
Next week, too. But, and thank you for bringing the story. I was just gonna share, this book, The Ornament of the World, you probably, I'm sure, read it, is if you want a companion reader to what we're learning about, it's really a good book. And I just, anybody that's interested, I'll have it over here if you want to order it. I think you get it on Amazon. Probably. But to the
Thank
point-
you. Yeah, thank you so much. That is a gorgeous book that covers this history and is actually, for my money, one of the best academic monographs out there on any subject. It is a book that I actually teach as an example of beautiful writing. So I hope if this is at all interesting to you, that you do look to that kind of, it's an incredible one.
What's the name of the book?
It's called The Ornament of the World.
Okay, thank you.
So I think that, the Jewish people see themselves as the chosen people.
Mhm.
And the rest of us are Gentiles. The Muslims will say there is one God and his prophet is Muhammad. The Christians will say Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, the life, and no man may enter the kingdom of heaven. How do you square that with the convivencia and stay out of my business or whatever? I guess that those seem in pretty stark tension.
Well, they do, but you need to remember that,
Or let me rephrase the question. I'm sorry. How did a priest of that day say you should not evangelize to a Muslim or a Jew or a Muslim mufti or whatever, say that to his flock, say leave the Christians alone and don't try to convert.
so the first thing I'll say is, much like sibling rivalries, which seem so fantastically hot when you're in it and you're like, oh, like I hate you, brother. Actually, from the outside, you're like, no, you love each other. That's one of the reasons why these passions fly so high, right? So one of the important things to remember, especially in this part, is that in some ways, what unites these three religions, right, is more than some of the other communities around them, right? They are monotheistic. Of course, we will quibble, right? And so a Muslim will take a look at this. Tell me about this like tripartite thing, like, and tell me about Mary, like how does that really jive with like monotheism? But for the most part, they, in many ways, because they are descended and consider themselves to be descended from Abraham, they share more than they might with some of the polytheistic peoples that they encounter when the Muslim empire is expanding. Now, to your question, if we had a time machine and suddenly we had like a Jewish judge and a Christian judge and a Muslim judge, and we asked them, well, how did you reconcile this with your flocks, right, with your people? For the most part, the sources indicate that religious leaders told people to stand tall within your law, right? So like within your law, do what your law asks you to do, and then don't try to interact too much on these questions with others, right? Which, sounds to us a little confusing, but actually tends to reflect the way we organize our lives today, right? For the most part, we tend to find people who share our religious ideas and we spend time with them. And when we try to cross these confessional bridges, it has to be a very explicit a desire to do that, and not everybody does, right? To the point where we literally have organizations that try to get us to do this in a productive way, right? Because it's not natural for us to do it. So one way to think about it, and one of the ways that I explain it to my students, is imagine a world where there's just like these three bubbles, right? And you and I live in a world where those bubbles live within a secular and civil environment where we know that we can interact with each other outside of those bubbles at, for example, the court of law, right? Or in the public school system, where your confessional identity is not your primary one. They don't live in that world. They live in a world where those three bubbles just exist without that larger secular and civil background. Did that help at all? Yeah.
I find it really interesting when you kept talking about the religious tolerance of different religions and how the fact that kind of lasted for a very long time. So I guess my main question is, when the Civil War broke out and then that one capital broke into smaller city states or small cities, did the concept of religious tolerance and that whole process of equal justice and stuff, did that carry on to these other smaller states, or did that kind of slowly begin to fall apart?
So that's a really great question. And for the most part, it carries on, right? It will all fall apart in 1492, right? And sort of working up towards that. But for the most part, and remember there's like 500 years between the fall of Cordoba and 1492. For the first like 300 years, yes, you and I would find what we would consider to be convivencia in these different types of communities. Absolutely.
Would you describe the town we're living in now as one of convivencia?
Absolutely not. I would describe the time that we're living in now one of ideological tolerance, where we expect laws to be passed that everybody will respect to tolerate each other. But in general, as tragically we have seen in moments of conflict in the past few years, those laws are passed because they don't reflect our lived reality, right? This is the opposite. There are actually laws on the books during these times that you and I read and we're like, that's terrible, right? Like, for example, Alfonso the Wise, we'll hear about next time, he passes a law that says that if a Christian has the misfortune of converting to Islam or Judaism, they need to die. Like, we look at that law and we're like, that's not a very tolerant law, right? So it's not ideological tolerance, but if you actually take a look at the lived experience, how people actually live, often in rejection of these formal laws, you find convivencia. I would argue that we live in the opposite world, right? Where we have laws that tell us you should do this, you can't do that, and yet, as we know, graveyards are desecrated, right? We don't fully, those laws don't actually reflect the way we live our lives.
I feel ignorant about the word infidel. Like, I assume that it pertained to either criminals or people of different religious sects or different ideologies. But I mean, what am I?
No, I mean, infidel, if we break the word down, just means that doesn't share faith, right? Like
Right.
infidel, you don't share my faith. Depending on which perspective we're talking about, right? What's really interesting about teaching this time period is I can find a primary source where you have a Muslim observer, writing about a war and talking about how, we, by the grace of Allah, we killed thousands of the Christian infidels, right? And only 3 of us found martyrdom, right? But then you can find a Christian chronicler talking about, another war 5 years later, who says pretty much the same thing, right? By the grace of God, right, and Santiago, right, St. James, we were able to kill thousands of the Muslim infidels, right? And only a few of us went to the arms of Christ, right? So the dynamic is the same. It just depends which confessional tradition you're coming from. Yes.
Yes, I've heard of something called Sharia law. Could you expand or explain what that is?
Right, and so this is the moment where I have to tell you that I am not myself a scholar of Islamic law, right? But I can tell you what I've learned as I'm teaching about this environment. And so Sharia law is Islamic law, right? So the same way that if you take a look at the books of the Old Testament, right? There are rules, there are laws, right? And the Jewish people also maintained law codes that were addressing not just questions of Jewish faith, but in some cases, what you and I would think of as civil disputes between Jewish people, right? So Sharia law is just the Islamic equivalent, right? It is the religious law under Islamic code that develops over hundreds and hundreds of years, right? As people read that, the Quran, and as they collect the sayings of the Prophet, and as the accumulated legal wisdom of observers over years builds up, that creates the code that you and I would think of as Sharia law now. So Sharia law is Islamic religious law.
If I can follow up, what you're telling us is that there are kind of 3 distinct communities in a way who have their own laws. And somehow they interrelate as well. If they don't insist on the people in the other communities following what their rules, religion, and the that.
Yes, that's exactly what convivencia means. And so one of the things to point out is that, so this is a medieval concept, right? That's why there isn't a civil and legal code that all of us share independent of our religion, right? And it's also important to recognize that this is a moment when there is some religious diversity in other parts of Europe. Like there are Jewish communities in other parts, other kingdoms of Europe. They will be exiled much faster than they are in Spain, right? What makes Spain unique is the large numbers of these three different communities, so that they maintain an equilibrium, right, that you don't find in other parts of Europe. And scholars argue, that they are then able to create a unique culture that we look back now, and we now call Spanish, right, or Castilian, but it's actually the product of these three faiths living together for hundreds of years and creating things like those Visigothic arches that you and I look at now and say, oh, that's Islamic influence. No. That is an indigenous Iberian cultural adaptation that brought in Islamic, Jewish, Christian, aesthetic, and ideological traditions.
Did the people live in separate neighborhoods or?
Yes, for the most part.
Okay.
Yes. But they would share key infrastructure, like they would share bakeries, they would share bathhouses, but there would have been very distinct neighborhoods where you would expect to find mostly Muslims, mostly Jews, mostly Christians. They're not formally yet what you and I would think of as ghettos, right? That comes later in European history. But again, like tends to flock with like. Yeah.
So, good. So I guess I get some kind of small perspective that there was some degree of discrimination, yet again, they were very religious tolerance. That's, I guess, what I'm getting at. Just following up on separate communities within the capital. I guess that's what I'm kind of trying to see or ask. Some kind of degree of discrimination or left.
So is this discrimination against Christians?
Well, just like,
or conflict within the Christian community?
well, just kind of discrimination, between, the Muslim, the Christian, the Jewish. It's kind of.
Yeah, I mean, it's, the problem when we use the word discrimination is that when we use that word now, it assumes that we're going against a law that tells us we should treat each other equally, right? Whereas in this world, they don't really have that law. They're just treating each other equally because they happen to share the same space and share the same infrastructure, right? We can talk more about this as soon as David does.
No, I don't want to chase you off. I just was good. You can talk a few minutes more. I actually have to go, but I want to say thank you to Ivonne, first of all. That blew my mind because I was like, oh, no wonder I couldn't explain it very well when people ask me about it. But thank you very much. And if you want to stay after for a few minutes and talk with Ivonne, that's fine. I just thought I'd at least stop it officially, but please
Absolutely.
take a
Thank
few
you
more
so much.
questions if you want to. Chrissy told me to stop this. I don't know how to stop it. Oh, no, that's not yours. I'm supposed to stop this. That's yours. Sorry about that.
That is not mine, so no worries.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I'm here.
That's right. It's easier.
So, but again, thank you, Ivonne, and I hope you come back next week and hear more about the poetry and those shards, which I love the idea and the concept of that kind of spreading out throughout that area and the kind of after effects of this. But please stay for a minute, ask any more questions, and otherwise, if you've been to church, great. Otherwise, I'll see you in a few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much.